The third invitation arrived on a Tuesday, and Clara Ashford burned it the same way she had burned the first two. She did not read it through. She had learnt not to. The paper was cream, the hand was looping and confident, and the name at the top was Mrs. Hartley of Merton House, which told her everything she needed to know before she reached the bottom. She touched one corner to the candle on the kitchen table and watched it take. It curled first, then caught fully, then was gone. She set the candlestick back in its place and went to the window. Outside, the lane that ran past her gate was empty in the way January lanes always are in Merton Cross. Bare hedges and frozen mud, and not a soul moving in either direction. The house across the lane, 3 times the size of her own, had its upper windows lit. She could see a figure moving behind the glass. She did not wave. The figure did not look toward her. 9 years. Not a long time if you measured it in other ways. It was long enough for a child born in that year to be old enough to read, long enough for fashions to turn twice, long enough for certain accusations, made without proof and never withdrawn, to become simply accepted as fact by everyone who had once called her a friend. Her husband, Edmund Ashford, had been a decent man who kept poor records and trusted a business partner who did not deserve trust. When the partnership collapsed and the creditors descended, the partner had pointed at Edmund and named him the cause. Edmund had died of a fever 6 months into the inquiry, before it was resolved, before his name was cleared, before anyone had to admit they had been wrong. The inquiry closed without a verdict. Society did not require a verdict. Society had already decided. Clara had been 26 years old. She was 35 now, and she was not ashamed, and she was not bitter, and she was not particularly interested in being restored to a position she had never valued as much as those who removed her from it seemed to think she should. What she was, on this Tuesday morning in January, was cold, because the fire in the kitchen needed more wood, and she had not yet gone to fetch it. She fetched it. She built the fire back up, put the kettle on, and sat down with the household account book she had been working through since before breakfast. The columns were tidy. They were always tidy. Numbers did not lie, and they did not take sides, and they did not omit your name from anything. Clara had come to appreciate that about them. She was halfway through the 3rd column when someone knocked at the gate. She did not recognize the young man on the other side of it. He was perhaps 18, wearing a coat that was too thin for the weather, and an expression of someone who had been told very clearly where to go, and was not entirely sure why. "I am looking for a Mrs. Ashford." On behalf of Fenwick Hall, she had not heard that name spoken in her direction in some time. Fenwick Hall stood 4 miles east of Merton Cross, set back from the road behind a stand of old oaks that made it invisible in summer and imposing in winter when the branches were bare. The Duke of Fenwick had inherited it 9 years ago, and had, by all accounts, not done much with it in a social sense since. She had heard he was reclusive. She had heard he was cold. She had heard, from Mrs. Hartley across the lane, who heard everything and shared all of it freely, that the Duke had not attended a single gathering in the county since he arrived. She had not paid those accounts much attention. She had her own reclusion to manage. "Yes," she said. "I am Mrs. Ashford." The young man held out a letter. It was sealed with plain wax. No crest. She broke it open there at the gate with numb fingers and read it standing up, because she had learned not to go inside with things that might require a reaction she preferred not to have in front of witnesses. The letter was brief. It was written in a hand that pressed firmly into the paper, each letter distinct, no flourishes. It said that the steward of Fenwick Hall, a Mr. Horace Pell, had recommended her name to the Duke as a woman of some competence with figures, that the estate was in need of a second review of certain accounts related to the farm tenancies, and that she would be compensated for her time at a fair rate if she was willing to attend the hall on Thursday next. There was no mention of her husband. There was no mention of her history. There was no apology for the shortness of the notice, either, which she found she appreciated more than an apology would have. She folded the letter. "I will come on Thursday," she told the young man. He looked relieved. He had probably been told to expect an argument. She went back inside and looked at the burned place on the kitchen table where the invitation had been. Then she opened the account book again and went back to work. Fenwick Hall was larger than it looked from the road. Clara arrived in the cart belonging to Mr. Gibbs the carrier, who made the run between Merton Cross and the Hall every Thursday with supplies for the kitchen. She had arranged it herself 3 days prior by the simple method of going to the carrier's yard and asking. No one had offered to send a conveyance for her. She had not expected one. The drive curved through the oaks and opened onto a front aspect that was handsome and severe in equal measure. Stone gone grey-gold with age, sash windows that wanted cleaning, a front door that was clearly never used. She was brought around to a side entrance by a housekeeper named Mrs. Fenn, who was brisk and not unkind, and who seemed uncertain what category Clara fell into socially, which Clara thought was fair. The room she was taken to was not a drawing room. It was not a study either, though it had a desk in it. It had the feel of a room that had been pressed into use for something it was not designed for, with chairs pushed to the wall to make space for a large table, covered in ledgers and bound correspondence, and at the far end a man who did not look up when she entered. She had expected Mr. Pell. The man at the end of the table was not Mr. Pell. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair going grey at the temple, in a way that suited him without his apparently noticing it. His coat was plain, and his cravat was tied with the energy of a man who had tied it himself without a mirror. He was reading something. He continued reading it. Mrs. Fenn announced her. The man looked up. His face was not cold, exactly. It was careful. There was a difference, and Clara had spent 9 years developing the ability to tell the two apart. Cold faces had decided something about you before you arrived. Careful faces had decided only to see. You are Mrs. Ashford. It was not a question, but she answered it as though it were. I am. And you are not Mr. Pell. A pause. Something moved in his expression that was not quite amusement and not quite surprise. No, I am Fenwick. Pell is in the village on estate business. He recommended your name. I asked to meet you myself before you began. She understood. He was checking whether she was suitable. She had no objection to being assessed by someone who was willing to do it honestly and to her face. She sat down without being invited to, pulled off her gloves, and looked at the nearest ledger. What is it you need reviewed? Another pause. Longer. The farm tenancy accounts for the last 4 years. Pell prepared them. I have a man in London who reviewed them last autumn and found nothing irregular. I am not satisfied. And why are you not satisfied? Because the income from the Northfields has declined each year for 4 years, and the tenant there has been farming the same land for 12 years without incident. And when I asked Pell to explain it, he gave me 3 different explanations on 3 separate occasions. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same careful expression. She looked at the ledger. May I? It was not a question either. He pushed it toward her across the table. She opened it at the beginning and began to read. Not skimming, reading, column by column, figure by figure, her finger moving down the page without touching it, hovering an inch above the numbers. He did not interrupt her. She did not ask him to leave. The fire in the grate burned down by a visible margin before she looked up. There is an error here, she said. Where? She turned the book to face him and pointed. Not in the sums. The sums are correct. The categories are wrong. Someone has been filing rental income from the Northfields under an account heading for seasonal labour. It would look like a decline in rental income and a rise in labour costs simultaneously. Anyone reviewing the totals would find both individually plausible. He was very still. "Is it a mistake?" she said, "or is it deliberate?" He did not answer immediately. He was looking at the page where she had pointed, and then he was looking at her, and the careful expression had shifted into something she could not quite name. "I do not know yet," he said. She nodded. "Then that is what you need to find out." She closed the ledger and picked up her gloves and stood. "I can come back on Saturday if you wish me to review the remaining years. You will want the labour accounts as well, and the correspondence with the Northfield tenant. If the tenant has been paying the correct amount and the books show something different, you will find the evidence in the correspondence." He stood as well, which she had not expected. "Saturday," he said. "I will send the cart." She did not tell him she had come in the carrier's cart. It seemed beside the point. She said she would be ready at 9, and she went out through the side door the way she had come in, and she did not look back at the house, and she was not certain why she felt that not looking back required any particular effort. She came on Saturday. She came on the following Tuesday as well, because he sent a note asking if she could. And she could. By the third visit she had her own chair at the table, and Mrs. Fenn had taken to leaving a tray without being asked. The tray always had more on it than Clara would have thought to request, which she took as Mrs. Fenn's way of expressing an opinion without stating one. The Duke of Fenwick, she was learning, was not what she had been told. He was not cold. He was careful, as she had first assessed, but beneath the care there was something that moved quickly and did not suffer in precision. He asked good questions. He listened to the answers with the kind of attention that made a person feel that the answer mattered more than the conversation surrounding it. He did not repeat himself. He did not waste her time with pleasantries that neither of them required. On the third visit she found the full shape of the error. It was not a mistake. She sat with that for a moment, looking at the columns, before she said anything. 4 years, she said, not a single miscategorization in the first 8 years of these accounts. Then 4 consecutive years of the same error, applied consistently, in the same hand, always to the Northfield income, always roted to the same labour sub-account. He was standing behind her, reading over her shoulder, which had stopped feeling strange somewhere around the second visit. "Pell," he said. "It is Pell. It appears so." He straightened. She heard him move to the window. "The Northfield tenant," she said, turning in her chair. "Mr. Oldbourne. Has he ever complained directly to you? Once, 2 years ago. He wrote to say he believed his rental payments were not being properly recorded. Pell told me Oldbourne was confused about the terms of his lease. And you believed Pell." A silence. "I had no reason not to," he said, at that point. She nodded. She was not going to press on it. She was not his conscience, and he was clearly pressing on it well enough himself. "What I do not understand," she said, "is where the money has gone. The amount is not small. Over 4 years, with compound effect on the income projections, you are looking at losses of perhaps 1/3 of what the Northfields should have returned. That is a significant sum. Pell does not appear to live extravagantly. Then, he is hiding it, or he is sending it somewhere." She thought about that. "Or someone is making him," she said. He turned from the window. She looked at him directly. Someone with a reason to want the Northfield income to look poor. Someone who might benefit from the farm appearing less productive than it is. An interested party. His expression changed. "My cousin," he said, very quietly. She waited. "Reginald Kahn. He has been trying to purchase the Northfields for 3 years. I refused him. The fields are not for sale. But if the income from them declined sufficiently, and if I could be persuaded that the farm was failing rather than being sabotaged, He might make a case that I should cut my losses. She set down her pen. Do you have a solicitor you trust? One, in London. You should write to him today. He was already moving toward the desk. She watched him sit down and begin to write, and she turned back to the ledger and went on working. And the fire burned steadily, and outside the window the oaks stood bare against a white sky, and it was the most ordinary afternoon imaginable, and yet she was aware of something in the room that had not been there before she arrived. Something that had no name in the account books, no column to go in, no category that made it easier to understand. She did not try to name it, she added up the column instead. It came out exactly right. She was making a fair copy of the evidence summary when Mr. Pell walked in. He had not knocked. He was the kind of man, she now saw, who had stopped knocking at doors some time ago and had not noticed. He was perhaps 50, with a florid face and the look of a man who was competent enough at his work to have never been seriously questioned about it. He looked at Clara, he looked at the ledgers spread across the table, he looked at the Duke, who had risen from the desk. A very particular kind of stillness came into his face. "Mrs. Ashford," he said. "What a surprise. I expect it is," she said, and went on writing. Pell looked at the Duke. Something was passing between them, some rapid calculation, and Clara watched it in her peripheral vision without appearing to. "A word privately, Your Grace," Pell said. The Duke looked at Clara. She kept her eyes on the page. "Anything you have to say to me, you may say here," the Duke said. Pell looked at Clara again. She finished the line she was writing and set her pen down and looked back at him, because she had learned that looking away from certain kinds of attention only encouraged it. He smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "I only wondered," he said, "whether your Grace had given thought to the wisdom of bringing a woman of Mrs. Ashford's particular history into the estate records, given her late husband, given the nature of the inquiry." She felt the familiar cold drop in her stomach. She had been waiting for it. She had known from the moment she began to see the full shape of what was in those ledgers that it would come. She did not look at the Duke. "Mrs. Ashford has been assisting at my request," the Duke said. "Her work has been precise and her judgment excellent. I have no concerns about her history." Pell nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. "Of course. I only mention it because certain parties in the county might not view it so generously. If it were to become known that the Fenwick estate accounts had been reviewed by the widow of a man investigated for fraud, however unfairly, it might raise questions." "It is raising questions," Clara said, not looking up from the page. "Specifically, mine, a silence." She looked up then. She had spent 9 years learning not to flinch, and it had cost her considerably, and she found she was grateful for it now. "If you are suggesting," she said, "that I ought to withdraw from work I have been asked to do, on grounds of a reputation I did not earn, in order to protect a man who has been quietly stealing from his employer for 4 years, I am afraid I find that suggestion unpersuasive." Pell was very still. "I would be careful, Mrs. Ashford," he said, very quietly. "I am always careful," she said. "It is one of the few reputations I do have." He looked at the Duke once more, and then he left. The door closed behind him. Clara went back to writing. Behind her the Duke did not speak for a long moment. Then he said, "I should have found this 4 years ago." She turned in her chair. "You found it now," she said. "That is what matters." He looked at her across the table, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything further, and it was enough. 3 days later the letter arrived, not at the Hall, at her house, slid under her gate on a dark morning before she was awake, written in a hand she did not recognise, with no salutation. It said that if she produced the account evidence she had compiled for the Duke of Fenwick, or spoke of what she had found to any magistrate or solicitor, Mr. Horace Pell was prepared to supply sworn testimony and documentary evidence that Clara Ashford had. in the weeks before her husband Edmund Ashford's death, been aware of and party to the financial fraud that had destroyed his business partners. He had 3 witnesses prepared to confirm it. He had, he said, been holding this information for some years, waiting for a reason to use it. She read it twice. She folded it. She put on her coat. And she walked 4 miles to Fenwick Hall. She arrived before 8 in the morning. Mrs. Fenn opened the side door and looked at her face and did not ask questions. She simply brought her inside and went to find the Duke. He came down in a coat that was not yet properly settled on his shoulders, as though he had put it on quickly. And his expression when he saw her in the corridor was not careful at all. It was alarmed. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. She watched him read it. His face went through several things in quick succession, none of which were difficult to interpret. When he had finished, he set it down on the hall table. "This is false," he said. "I know it is false. He knows it is false. The question is whether it matters that it is false." He looked at her. She looked back. She had walked 4 miles in January to bring him this letter rather than burning it as she had burned other unwelcome paper. Because she was tired, she realized, of burning things. She had been burning things for 9 years. Evidence of her own exclusion, her own erasure, her own diminishment, one careful, controlled fire at a time, and she was simply tired of it. "I have the evidence summary here," she said. "I brought it with me. You should give it to your solicitor today. Whatever Pell threatens does not change what those ledgers say." He was quiet for a moment. "And you?" She? Was that what he was asking? She would manage, she said. She had been managing. "That is not what I asked." She stopped. She looked at him properly. "What did you ask?" He took a step toward her, and then seemed to check himself. And she had the impression of a man who had spent 9 years checking himself at the precise moment it mattered, and who was finding the habit difficult to break. "I asked about you," he said. "Not about your management. About what you want." She had not been asked that in a very long time. She looked at him standing in his own corridor in his hastily settled coat, with the letter on the hall table between them and the evidence she had spent 3 weeks compiling under her arm, and she thought about what she wanted. She wanted it to matter. That was all. She wanted the work to matter, and the truth to matter, and herself, specifically herself, to be seen as something other than a liability or a cautionary tale or a name left off a list. She said so. Not all of it, not the list, but the rest of it. He listened. When she finished, he looked at the letter again. "I am going to write to my solicitor," he said. "Now this morning. And then I am going to Merton Cross." She waited. "Alone?" "No," he said. "Not alone." She did not ask what he meant. He wrote the letter. She sat at the table that had become her table and organised the evidence into the order the solicitor would need, and outside the window the January morning lightened by degrees into something that was not quite grey and not quite bright, but somewhere between, the way January mornings sometimes unexpectedly are. His solicitor arrived from the county town by noon. He was a compact man named Mr. Farwell, with a slightly harried look of someone who had been given the outline of the situation in a letter and had immediately understood it was worse than it sounded. He went through the evidence with methodical speed. He agreed with every conclusion Clara had drawn. He used the word incontrovertible twice, which she found satisfying. Then Reginald Carney arrived. He had not been summoned. Someone had told him, which meant Pell had told him. Which meant Pell had known before sending the letter that it might not work, and had already set his second action in motion. Carney was perhaps 45, well dressed in a way that suggested he thought about it, with the manner of a man who entered rooms expecting them to reorganise around him. He looked at Clara sitting at the table, and he looked at the solicitor, and he looked at his cousin, and he made his calculation. "This is irregular," he said to the Duke. Having a woman of this description reviewing private estate accounts. Mr. Farwell cleared his throat. The accounts, Khan said, keeping his eyes on the Duke. The situation, her presence here. You understand how it looks. I understand, the Duke said, how it looks to people who require everything to look a particular way, regardless of what it is. Yes, I understand that completely. Clara set down her pen. She had been writing something. She continued. The situation with Pell, Khan said. It can be managed quietly. He can be paid to withdraw the letter. The widow can be compensated for her trouble and her silence, and this need go no further. The solicitor can manage the farm accounts going forward, and there is no need for any of this to become a matter of public discussion. She did not look up from the page, the Duke said, and the North Fields. Khan did not answer immediately. I would be prepared, he said, to offer a fair price. The Duke of Fenwick looked at his cousin for a long time. Then he said, Get out of my house. Khan did not move immediately. He looked at the solicitor, who looked at the window. He looked at Clara, who was still writing, and did not look back. He left. Mr. Farwell exhaled. The Duke sat down in the chair across the table from Clara. She looked up. He looked tired, she thought, not defeated. Tired in the way a person looks when they have been carrying something for a long time and have just set it down, and the setting down is a relief, but the muscles still remember the weight. Pell, Mr. Farwell said from the window, where he had gone to stand during the exchange with Khan. I can have a letter to the magistrate by this afternoon. He will be questioned. Given what you have here, I do not think he will be in a position to press his threatened evidence. Fabricated testimony tends not to survive scrutiny once the fabricator is himself under examination. Clara looked at the Duke. He looked at her. Then she said, something quite separate from everything else. I should like to go home. He stood. Yes, he said, I will take you. She had not expected that. He called for the carriage. It was a good carriage. Dark, well-maintained, with the Fenwick crest on the door in understated gilt. She had not noticed it in the stable-yard before. They drove through the oaks and onto the road, and the 4 miles between Fenwick Hall and Merton Cross passed in the kind of quiet that is not the absence of things to say, but rather the presence of too many things, sorted and set aside by mutual agreement for a moment that was not yet. She watched the lane approaching. She saw, from the carriage window, that there were people in the street. Mrs. Hartley was on her doorstep. 2 of her regular companions were with her, and a third woman Clara recognised from a dinner she had attended 11 years ago and had not been invited to since. They were all looking at the carriage. They were looking at it in the way people look at something unexpected, something that disrupts the established order of things in a way that requires explanation. The carriage turned into the lane. It stopped at her gate. The Duke stepped out first. He opened the gate himself. He did not wait for the driver. He pushed it open, and he held it. And he offered her his hand, on the step of his carriage, in the lane of Merton Cross, in front of Mrs. Hartley and all her companions, as though there were no question at all about who was being brought home, and by whom and with what degree of public intention. She took his hand. She stepped down. She did not look at Mrs. Hartley. She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the careful expression that was not cold at all and never had been, and beneath it something that was considerably warmer, and he said, in a voice that was quiet but not private, since the lane was not particularly large, I intend to call on you on Friday, if that is acceptable. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, It is acceptable. He held the gate until she had passed through it. Then he released it. She heard the latch settle behind her. She heard the carriage move. She heard from across the lane complete and thorough silence, which was more gratifying than any invitation had ever been. He called on Friday. He called on the following Monday as well, and on the Wednesday after that, and by the end of February it had become a pattern that neither of them discussed and both of them relied on. He came in the afternoons. He came in the mornings when there was something at the hall he wanted to show her. He came in the evenings twice, which was less conventional, and on both occasions Mrs. Fenn appeared at the door shortly afterward with a covered dish. As though she had arranged this without consulting anyone. Clara let the dish in. The accounts at Fenwick Hall were now in the hands of a new man recommended by Mr. Farwell, competent and unimaginative, who would do his work correctly and without drama. Pell had been questioned by the county magistrate in February, and had, as Mr. Farwell predicted, found that his threatened evidence dissolved under examination. He had left the county. Reginald Carne had made no further approach. The Northfields continued to produce exactly what they had always produced, which was a great deal, as it turned out, when the figures were honestly kept. Clara went on managing her own accounts. She went on keeping her own kitchen and her own garden and her own hours. She went on walking to the village when she needed to, and if certain doors now opened with slightly more warmth than they had before, and certain faces turned toward her rather than away, she received this without ceremony. She did not require ceremony. She had always required, only accuracy. The accuracy of what she was now seemed to be something that the village of Merton Cross was adjusting to, more or less in the order of who had most recently seen the Fenwick carriage at her gate. Mrs. Hartley left a card. Clara read it with no particular expression and left it on the kitchen table. On a morning in early March, when the garden showed the first signs of the work she had put into it through the winter, he came later than usual and found her outside with her hands dirty and her hair less managed than she typically presented it in his company. And he stood at the gate and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. She straightened. Something had been accumulating between them across the weeks. Something that every careful person and every person who had learnt to be careful by necessity recognised as the thing that careful people generally do their best to avoid naming until it absolutely demanded to be named. He opened the gate. He did not say anything clever. She was grateful for that. She had been the recipient of clever things said in gardens by men who meant them less than they sounded, and she had no patience for the format. He said, "I would like this not to change." She looked at him. He said, "Specifically, I would like this. The part where I arrive, and you are here, and the morning has the shape of something I was looking forward to, not to change at any point in the future I can currently conceive of." She looked down at her hands, which were not at their best. She looked back up at him. She said, "I would like that also." He came through the gate and stood 2 feet from her and looked at her with the kind of attention that she had first read as assessment and now knew was something else entirely. Something that had no efficient entry in the ledgers she kept, but occupied a considerable amount of the space she had recently begun to make available. He took her hands, which were dirty, without any visible concern about it. He said, "Then I think we should be quite direct about it." She said, "I have always preferred that." He said, "Then I am asking." She already knew what he was asking. She had known for some time. She had been keeping the knowledge in a column she had not yet totalled, because she found she wanted to be sure of every figure before she added it up. She was sure. She said yes. He did not say anything further for a moment. He simply held her hands in the garden in the early light of March, and the gate stood open behind him, and the lane beyond it was just a lane, ordinary and quiet, and 9 years felt, all at once, like a distance that had been precisely the right length for arriving here. She was married in May, quietly, at the church in the village, with Mr. Farwell as a witness, and Mrs. Fenn weeping in the back row, as though she had arranged the entire thing herself, which she may have done. The house at the edge of the lane was not given up immediately. She kept it for some months, visiting it when she wanted the particular quality of quiet that a person knows only in the place they made livable alone. She watered the garden. She sat at the kitchen table on Tuesday mornings sometimes, and there was nothing on it to burn, and she found she did not miss the ritual. Only what it had once meant to be the kind of woman whose name certain people preferred to leave off things. That was over. Not because anyone had apologized. No one had apologized, and she had not required it. It was over because it had served its purpose, which was to bring her, slowly and indirectly, and through considerable unnecessary difficulty, to the gate of Fenwick Hall on a January morning, with evidence under her arm, and enough left in her to walk through it. The gate at Fenwick Hall had been repainted by June. A deep green, with the ironwork oiled and the latch resettled. It opened easily. She walked through it every day. She did not look back at the Lane House the last morning she was there. She had no reason to. Everything she had ever needed was already inside.